Hello students, welcome to week 3 of Sci 1010 General Psychology. In this session, we will talk about learning, one of the first and greatest topics in the history of psychology. That honestly, if I want to talk to you about this history, I should say that a great part of psychology begins with the history of learning. So let's start it with the major topics in about history. We have several parts here, especially classical conditioning and operant conditioning and observational learning and other cognitive approaches to learning. At first, it starts with classical conditioning. What are the learning objectives? Or describe the basics of classical conditioning and how they relate to learning. Give examples of line conditioning principles to human behavior and explain extinction, what is extinction, and discuss stimulus generalization and discrimination. So at first we should know about the scientific definition of learning, a relatively permanent change in behavior brought about by experience or rehearsal. So we have three items, three keywords in the scientific definition of learning. Attitude, when it is called learning, that you will confront with a permanent, relatively permanent change. Also, your book says about only behaviors, but it includes cognitions, thoughts, beliefs, emotions, feelings, mood, affects, and finally your actions and behaviors, which are observable. It should be permanent change. If we cannot find any change after any type of experience or rehearsal, also it is rehearsal and experience, but it is not called learning. When it is called learning, that you can find relatively permanent change in the behaviors, in the actions, in the thoughts, in the beliefs, in the emotions, affects, moods, and feelings. So, the second part that shows that these permanent, relatively permanent change should brought about by your experience or rehearsal. For example, during the between the in the interval, time duration between 15 years old and 55 years old, all human beings, all female human beings experience menstruation monthly 4 weeks again. But it is a permanent change, yes. But they never have had learned it. They have never had uh, experiencing or by rehearsal. It is by biology. Because of biology, any type of learning, any type of change cannot be considered as learning. When it is considered as learning, that you can find any types of experiences or rehearsals in the behavior. And after that rehearsal, after that experience, you can find some types of permanent change in behavior, actions, and thoughts and feelings. So the second element is after change. The second element is it should be uh, it should be brought about by experience or rehearsal. And the third component, the third element for describing and define the learning in a scientific approach is about permanent. Your change should be permanent, also relatively permanent, not completely permanent. So permanency, change, and experience or rehearsal as a cause should be considered in the scientific definition of learning. So we have several types of learning. All of them are categorized in three approach. One, conditioning approach, two, observational approach, and three, cognitive approach. In this part, we want to talk about the conditioning approach as the basic approach to create any type of learning in all beings, all we call it higher functioning brain, higher functioning of brain. All the beings like mammals, especially mammals, that who have higher functioning of brain, higher cortical function. Cortex is the last layer, in the highest layer of your brain. Different, for example, cats, lions, dogs, all the pets, all the animals that we can use. Also, they are not pets, but we can use them in circus. And because of using the circus, we should learn something to them. It is based on the classical conditioning. What is classical conditioning? Classical conditioning is a type of learning in which a neutral stimulus comes to bring about a response after it is paired with a stimulus that naturally bring about that response. So we have different types of response and different types of stimulus here. Before entering the details of classical conditioning, I want to talk with you about one of the best brains, at least during the since the 200 years ago, is a very genius Russian scientist that he was not a psychologist, he was not a physician, he was a physiologist, but his work also, he is the first one who won the medical medicine Nobel Prize. I think it is about 92, or yeah, in the first 10 years, first 5 years of 20th centuries. He was Ivan Pavlov. Ivan Pavlov, Russian physiologist, never intended to do psychological research. Pavlov had been studying the secretion of stomach acids and salivation in dogs in response to ingestion of varying amounts and kinds of food. He was a physiologist. While doing that, he observed a curious phenomenon. Sometimes stomach secretions and salivation would begin in the dogs when they had not yet eaten any food. You see the salivation and stomach secretion and salivation naturally in a response to eating or seeing their food. But sometimes he observed a curious phenomenon. Sometimes the stomach secretions and salivation would begin in dogs when they had not yet eaten any food. The mere sight of the experimenter who normally brought the food, or even the sound of experiments footsteps, was enough to produce salivation in dogs. Pavlov's genius lay in his ability to recognize the implications of this discovery. He saw that the dogs were responding not only on the basis of a biological needs, like hunger, but also as a result of learning, or as it came to call, classical conditioning. In this picture, you can see Pavlov. Pavlov is in the middle, in the center, developed the principles of classical conditioning. And in his experiments, we have 5 types of stimulus and response. At first, it's a neutral stimulus, or bell. Before conditioning, this stimulus does not naturally bring about the response of interest. It is neutral stimulus, uh, ringing a bell. It is not. It cannot be considered as a cause of stomach secretion or salivation in a natural, for example, animal, in a healthy animal. It is neutral stimulus. After that, it is UCS, unconditioned stimulus, which is here meat, a stimulus that naturally brings about a particular response without having been learned. You don't need to learn how to, for example, have some stomach secretion when you see a meat or you eat a meat. It is unconditioned stimulus, naturally bring about a particular response. After that, we have unconditional response, salivation to meat, natural innate reflexive response, unlearned. So until this time, we have 2 types of stimulus: neutral stimulus with no natural effect, with no normal effect on the, for example, salivation, stomach secretion, and 2, unconditioned stimulus or natural stimulus. Sometimes it is called natural stimulus. The stimulus that we can find the natural response to that in any types of conditions. The next one is conditioned stimulus. It is Bell. Once the neutral stimulus paired with the UCS to bring about a response formerly caused by the UCS. It is meat, it is secretion. Bale is paired with meat. Bale is neutral stimulus. Bale doesn't cause any secretion in the stomach, any salivation. It is neutral. And it is natural or unconditioned stimulus, meat, for salivation. Neutral stimulus with the natural stimulus paired together. In this position, it is called, your neutral stimulus is called conditioned stimulus. Why? Because after sometimes a repeat and repeat and repeat, you can delete, and it is the response. The response for meat is natural response or unconditioned response. It is not related to condition. After some times of pairing, the human being, the dogs, the being knows that after listening the bell, after hearing the bell sound, he or she will receive some meat. It is called expectation. Because of that, before confronting with the meat, the being will have some secretion in stomach and other parts. Okay? So in this time, this neutral stimulus will become a conditioned stimulus or CS. Once the neutral stimulus paired with the UCS to bring about the response formerly caused by the UCS. And conditional response, that secretion, that salivation, now in response to Bell, the unconditioned response, which is responding to a, a conditioned stimulus. It is called conditioned response, not unconditioned. It should be there in conditioning. A neutral stimulus will bring about an unconditioned response. In this time, this unconditioned response is called conditioned response. It is the process of conditioning. Okay, so we have 5 types of stimulus and response here. Neutral stimulus, unconditioned stimulus or UCS, U for on, C as for condition, and stimulus for S. Unconditioned response, UCR. UCS is the natural stimulus, and UCR is the natural response. There is no need to any type of conditioning. And after that, your neutral stimulus will be something like your natural stimulus. So that neutral stimulus is called conditioned stimulus. And responding to your neutral stimulus will not be, is not a natural stimulus response. It is called conditioned response. Okay. Human behavior is also learned through classical conditioning, particularly emotional responses such as fear. The most unethical experiments in the first decades, I think it was 1922, in the first decades of 20th century by J.B. Watson and his colleague on a very, very young boy. I think he was 4 years or 2 years. You can see you can see it in the YouTube about Little Albert experiments by J.B. Watson, John B. Watson. They created fear in a very, very young boy, and after that, they desensitize that fear. As you know, after 20 years, Little Albert, who was not also Little Albert, who was Albert, went to court and created a lawsuit against his mother and J.B. Watson. And read a loud noise, as you can see the experiment. It's a very, very interesting experiment and also very unethical experiment in the history of psychology. Okay, it is neutral stimulus. It is natural stimulus. Pairing is called conditioning. Why? After pairing, we will see the natural response, which is called unconditioned response, in response to neutral stimulus. This response in that time is called conditioned response because the stimulus of that response is not a natural stimulus. It is called neutral stimulus. Okay, the state of change in our life is very important. In all history of human being, the thinkers, the philosophers, social leaders, even parents want to create something else and something more than them in their children, in their nation, in other people. So change is the major question, how to create change and what change we should create. About the what, philosophers and thinkers will have some, also religion have some answer for us. But how is the major question, especially when we want destroy the previous conditioning in ourselves. It is called extinction. A previously conditioned response decreases in frequency and eventually disappear. It is natural, it is conditioned stimulus, it is conditioned response. Okay, we say, please control your response. Sometimes we have conditioned stimulus without any type of unconditioned. We have neutral stimulus without any type of natural stimulus. After sometimes, for example, if it is about your salivation or your stomach secretion, after sometimes your body will know that yes, we can receive only neutral stimulus without pairing with any type of natural stimulus. After sometimes your body will not respond to any type of stimulus. It is called extinction in frequency and after that disappear. Spontaneous recoveries mean the reemergence of extinguished condition response after a period of rest and no further condition. It is called a spontaneous recovery. You can see here the chart for uh, extinction, acquisition, condition response, and unconditioned response presented together here in this part. And after that, it is diminished extinction, conditioned stimulus itself only. After that, we have a pause. It is training. In this part, you have pairing. For training, you should pair the neutral stimulus with natural stimulus. And after that, CS alone, only conditioned stimulus, only the first neutral stimulus. And after that, it is pause. Yeah. And finally, you have a spontaneous recovery without any pause. You have some neutral stimulus without any natural stimulus. It is pause, a spontaneous recovery of conditioned response, and after that, extinction flows conditioned stimulus alone. Generalization and discrimination are the other professional words, vocabulary, terminology we can use in learning the principles of learning. So these two concepts make us to predict the future so easily, especially by generalization. We can have some samples and generalize to other greater and bigger societies, bigger communities, bigger samples, and follow them in a very general aspects of life. Also, you know that in a very good book, so-called Feeling Good by David Burns, it's a very professional book also about 3 decades ago, but until now, it is also a good book to read by a general population. David Burns talked about 7 cognitive distortions One of them is overgeneralization. Also, now we are talking about generalization of behavior. Stimulus generalization said a conditioned response follows a stimulus that is similar to the original conditioned stimulus. For example, you know that, yes, everything something like it. For example, let me have a good example for you. Uh, there's a psychological problem disorder, so-called PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, for veterans, for especially for war-related veterans and rape-related veterans. They will experience their memory, the catastrophic memory, the sense of feeling of death in their, for example, sleep. It is called re-experience. And because of that, sometimes they are very, very hyper-arousal. They have many hyper-arousal behaviors, very anger, very oversensitive, overreactive. And in many times, they are always avoiding any types of stimulus to something like, for example, their dreams or their catastrophic event, their death-like events. It is a stimulus generalization. This stimulus is not something like that stimulus. It's not that stimulus. It's something like that, not exact that stimulus. It's something else, but very, very similar. And sometimes it is not very similar. It's a little similar, but because of stimulus generalization, we can say yes, this is something like that. So I will respond to the second, third, fourth similar stimulus like the first condition stimulus. Please pay attention. In a stimulus generalization, normally the basic stimulus is not natural stimulus. It is neutral stimulus. It is conditioned stimulus. The basic, the first one. And the second one, third one, fourth one are not the same. They are different, something like it. And sometimes it is not like that first condition stimulus, but I consider in my mind that it is something like that. And I will have some response like my response to a stimulus, the first condition stimulus. The greater the similarity, the greater the likelihood for generalization. And stimulus discrimination is in the oppositional part. If two stimulus are sufficiently different from each other, that one bring about the conditioned response, but the other does not, you can discriminate between two stimulus that you have had some experience simultaneously at the same time of both of them, but they are, for example, one of them is dark, one of them is bright, one of them is white, one of them dark. It is at the two extreme of anything. You can discriminate between these stimulus. So we are talking about the similarities and differences. We are talking about the more similarities for generalization and more differences for discrimination. In this part, we have a good study alert, learn and understand the process and terminology of classical conditioning, which can be confusing. Study, not study hard, study very with the details about the terminology of classical conditioning. The second part in this chapter, in this topic, is about another type of conditioning, which is called operant conditioning. Operant conditioning is not about the relationship between a stimulus and your response. It is about your actions and expectation of your actions, of the outcome, of the output of your action in the next step or in the future. Sometimes in the long-term future, sometimes in the not too far future. So in classical conditioning, you can find the relationship between the stimulus, and after that, we can see the conditioned or unconditioned response. Generally, when you are talking about the condition, you should see the conditioned response, because unconditioned response doesn't need any type of conditioning. It is the natural stimulus, at the natural response. This is called unconditioned stimulus, and it is called unconditioned response. In conditioning, classical conditioning, you create, or it is created by a random accident between a neutral stimulus, which is not a natural stimulus, and the same natural response that in this position it is called conditioned response. But in operant conditioning, we are talking about the future, about the gratification, about if it is about, we will talk about reinforcement and punishment. If it is about reinforcement, we are talking about delayed gratification, not instant gratification. The major topics, the major outcomes are: define the basics of operant conditioning, explain reinforcers and punishment, present the pros and cons of punishment, discuss schedules of reinforcement. It is a very confusing. Explain the concept of shaping behaviors. What is operant conditioning? Learning in which a voluntary response is strengthened, more likely to recur regularly, or weakened, less likely to recur regularly, depending on its favorable or unfavorable consequences. So, what are the keywords in operant conditioning? The first one is strengthening or weakening. The major part is about recur, less likely to recur or more likely to recur. Recurrence is very important. The probability, the likelihood of recurrency, and about the consequences of action, consequences of what you have done, and what is your expectation, your likelihood of expectation in the future. Reinforcement, the process by which a stimulus increases the probability that the preceding behavior will be repeated. So, at first, you should know that reinforcement is a process, is not a single step that you should take to reach the maximum or optimum point you want to have in the future. It is a process, many steps, and in a pathway from the present stage and present state to the ideal state or next stage. Okay, it is a process by which a stimulus increases. So when you are talking about reinforcement, you are about increasing the recurrency of something, that the preceding behavior will be repeated. It is reinforce. It gives you the force to the probability, to the likelihood of recurrency in the future. And reinforcer is the factor for reinforcement. Any stimulus that increases the probability, the likelihood that a preceding behavior will occur again, that stimulus is called reinforcer. Two major types of reinforcers. We have primary reinforcer and secondary reinforcer. What is the primary reinforcer? Satisfies some biological need and works naturally regardless of a person's previous experience. Food for a hungry person, warmth for a cold person, and relief for a person in pain, all would be classified as primary reinforcers. The major topic in defining primary reinforcer is about primary needs, basic needs, vital needs. But the secondary reinforcer, in contrast, is a stimulus that becomes reinforcing because of its association with a primary reinforcer. For example, we know that money is valuable because we have learned that it allows us to obtain other desirable objects. Money is a paper, doesn't have any value if you cannot convert it to the services, if you cannot convert it to the tools, if you cannot convert it to the goods. Okay? Materialistic, when you are looking at money materialistic, it is only a receipt of having some, for example, financial support for your receipt. It is the secondary reinforcer. It is not straight and direct related to primary reinforcer, including learned that it allows us to obtain other desirable objects, including primary resources such as food and shelter. Money thus become a secondary reinforcer. And positive and negative, it was one categorization of reinforcers. Primary reinforcers, primary that work with your primary needs, and secondary reinforcers, the reinforcers that work with you in the secondary part, in the secondary wave, with your problems, with your needs. Again, positive reinforcer and negative reinforcer. A stimulus added to the environment that brings about an increase in a preceding response. When we are talking about reinforcement, we are talking about increasing the likelihood of recurrence. If you increase the likelihood of recurrence of a preceding behavior by adding something, for example, you give prize to your child, adding something for increasing the recurrence of that preceding behavior in the future, this type of reinforcement is positive. Positive is not, it is about plus something, not minus something. Added something. Positive is mean adding or plus. In contrast, if you increase, the likelihood of recurrence of a preceding behavior by 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 minus, by removal something from the environment, it is called, it's reinforced, yes, it is reinforcement, but not by adding some new prizes, by removal or minus some negative points. For example, when you have pain and you receive a painkiller, is painkiller adding something to your body? No, it remove your pain, but it again, it increases the usage again in the future of painkillers, increasing the likelihood of recurrency of something, a persisting behavior. An unpleasant stimulus, normally uh, positive reinforcers are pleasant stimulus, and negative reinforcement and unpleasant, whose removal leads to an increase in a preceding response. The other types, on the other hand, of reinforcement, we see the punishment. Punishment is doing, adding, or removing something from behavior, something from environment, to decrease the likelihood of recurrence of something, a preceding behavior in the future. So the direction of reinforcement is increasing the likelihood of recurrency of preceding behavior. The direction of punishment is to decrease the likelihood of recurrency of a previous a preceding behavior. So in punishment, a stimulus that decreases the probability, the likelihood that a preceding behavior will happen again. Again, we have positive punishment and negative punishment. Again, we have punishment in the meaning of adding something, and negative in the meaning of removing something. Punishment, positive is mean plus something, and negative is mean minus something. Positive punishment, adding an unpleasant stimulus to the environment. For example, physical punishment is a positive punishment. It's a positive punishment. You add something to the environment, some unpleasant. I don't like your behavior. Because of that, I will decrease my recurrency of behavior in the future, the recurrency of my preceding behavior. Why? Because I know that you will, for example, have some physical attack to me. And negative punishment is removing of your pleasant stimulus. When I remove, when I cut, for example, your extra money you can receive from me in the next month, I said, no, I will not give you anything in the next month. I will punish you, but negative punishment. Negative punishment is I remove your desirable, your pleasant stimuli. Because of that, the probability, the likelihood of recurrence of your behavior will decrease in the future. You see here, we have when a stimulus added, when a stimulus removed or terminated. The result is positive reinforcement and positive punishment. If you add some pleasant stimuli to the environment, it is called positive reinforcement. If you add some unpleasant stimulus to the environment, it is called positive punishment. Punishment and reinforcement is about the consequences of action, about the outcome. Positive or negative, it is about adding or removing. So adding pleasant stimulus is called reinforcement, and positive is adding. Adding pleasant stimulus is called positive reinforcement. Adding unpleasant stimulus is called positive punishment. Removing pleasant stimulus is called negative punishment. Removing unpleasant stimulus is called negative reinforcement. You can see here, for example, giving a raise for good performance is adding a raise for good performance is adding something, so positive, and good performance is a result increase in response of a good performance. It is called positive reinforcement. Or yelling at a teenager when she steals a bracelet. It is adding something, yes. Decrease the frequency of response to stealing. And when you want to terminate something or remove something, it is called negative. Let me check the battery. The pros and cons of punishment. Punishment can be effective, but there are also disadvantages. Note that when we are talking about punishment, we are not always talking about, for example, physical punishment. Punishment adding unpleasant or removing pleasant, especially for children, for training, for parenting, highly recommended to negative punishment. Remove or terminate their prizes, their desirable stimulus they want as a negative punishment. But what are the disadvantages of punishment? Frequently ineffective if not delivered soon after undesirable behavior. It is very important. There should be nothing, no time duration between the fault and the punishment. If you waste time, the efficacy of your punishment will destroy. There is no outcome, no consequence of your punishment. Physical punishment can send message of approval and even encouragement of physical aggression in other situations. when you have some physical punishment with your son, with your daughter, with people around you, you say that yes, it is possible, it is permitted to have a physical reaction to me. So control your actions as an aggressive action. And sometimes difficult for punisher to control the degree amount of physical punishment in the heat of the moment. Many person in prison says that it was not on my hand. I lose my control. It was in the heat of the moment. Okay. We can create some schedule for reinforcement based on the rate of repeat and time interval. Schedule different patterns of frequency and timing of reinforcements following desired behavior. At first, it is CRS, continuous reinforcements schedule. It means that reinforcing of a behavior every time it occurs, learning occurs more rapidly. The consequence in continuous reinforcements schedule, good behavior, desired behavior, just after that, you will receive your reinforcement. You will receive your positive reinforcement. The consequences, learning occurs more rapidly. Partial or intermittent reinforcement schedule, reinforcing a behavior some but not all of the time it occurs. For example, I do something good, don't no reinforcement. I do something good, no reinforcement, no any award. And for example, after 4 times, I receive some award. The next time, after 2 times, it is intermittent reinforcement schedule of the time it occurs. It behaviors last longer after reinforcement stops, because the expectation is yes, if I do it, I do it, I do it, I will have some good award in the future, good prize in the future. The basic part of pathology gambling is based on this partial reinforcement. One time you win the game, and your expectation is to do it, to do it, to do it until the time that you will receive again another prize. And fixed ratio schedule reinforcement is given only after a specific number of responses are made. For example, rat receives a food pellet every 10 times it presses a lever. And variable ratio schedule says that, yes, you will give some award, but it is not known. It is not exact and certain that, for example, after 5 times, after 7 times, it is very random. Reinforcement occurs after a varying number of responses. For example, telephone salesperson's job. The final part is about shaping behavior. It is also sometimes like shaping your muscles. The process of teaching a complex behavior, not simple behavior. Simple behavior doesn't need any type of shaping. It is very simple. By rewarding closer and closer approximations of the desired behavior. First, reinforce any behavior that is remotely similar to the desire. It is remotely, but it is a little similar. Then reinforce only responses that are closer to the desired behavior. And finally, then reinforce only the desired behavior. Remote behaviors, near behaviors, exact behavior. Remote behaviors, remote very with a lower rate of similarity. Very similar and the exact, not similar, the same behavior that you have targeted to create in person. Shaping, you see here, basic principles, building association between a condition stimulus and condition response, nature of behavior based on the involuntary, natural, innate behavior, behaviors excited by the unconditioned or conditioned stimulus, and order of events and some examples. Study alerts here are, remember that primary reinforcers satisfy biological need. Secondary reinforcers are effective due to previous association with the primary reinforcer. We talk about it. And pay special attention to the rules in differences between positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, and negative punishment are tricky. And remember that different schedule of reinforcement affect the rapidity with which a response is learned and how long it lasts after reinforcement is no longer provided. The next part of this chapter talk about cognitive approaches to learning. The learning outcomes are explained, latent learning and how it works in humans. Two, discuss the influence of observational learning in acquiring skills. And three, describe research findings about observational learning and media violence. What is cognitive learning theory? In contrast with the conditioning, or sometimes it is called observational learning, focuses on the thought processes, cognitions that underlie learning, not about your visual learning, observational learning, not about your association between the stimulus and your actions, which you can find in classic conditioning, or about your actions and expected outcomes in the future, which you can find in operant conditioning. It is about the cognitions, belief system, rationality underlying your learning. Latent learning says learning in which a new behavior is acquired but is not demonstrated until some incentive is provided for displaying. You know, but you don't show. It is latent learning. Sometimes it is called hidden learning. Learning in which a new behavior is acquired but is not demonstrated until some incentive is provided for displaying. Cognitive maps a mental representation of a spatial location and direction. It is your cognitive map about what you have learned and what you want to show. And many times, latent learning is not under control of your conscious mind. Sometimes it goes a little lower, deeper, so-called sometimes semi-conscious, and not always, but sometimes it is called unconsciousness. Observational learning, learning by watching the behavior of another person, it is modeled. It is a great theory in learning psychology, coined by Albert Bandura, the professor of Stanford and University of British Columbia in Canada. Social cognitive approach, it is also called. And violence in media is very important because now we know we should have some media literacy. Media literacy is about your knowledge about the global effects of media on your life, on your lifestyle, on your behavior. And it's a false belief that if you look at the violence, if you look at the aggression in media, in television, in movies, after that you will be so calm. The sociological evidences shows that no, after watching at, or watching some, for example, aggressive movies or violence in movies, you will not release your tendency to have some aggression. There's nothing like it. Research supports that claim that watching high levels of media violence makes viewer more susceptible to acting aggressively. One study found one-fourth of violent young male offenders has attempted a media-inspired copycat crime. Okay, thanks for giving me your time and watching this video. It is a very short video about the general aspects of learning. I know that knowing the learning, the principles of learning, and something more than knowledge is applying this knowledge in your private life, social life, especially in your roles as a manager, as a leader in an organization, is very basic element to work scientifically with your colleagues, your employees, and other people around you, especially when you want to be a change manager. Have a good time.